building started, the idea behind your grandfather Schleswig was that we're going to be looking mainly here at first at one particular time period, mainly the late 40s into the 1950s, and look at the businesses and some of the businessmen that were involved here at that time. At the time when Schleswig was quite an active business community. There were businesses all the way up and down Main Street on both sides, and some of them were there for quite some time. And we'll be looking at some of these. We won't be getting a complete list by any means, because I think at one time or other in this time period, you took the businesses that were in business uptown and the ones that were in the residential area. There were Polar brush salesmen, there was a seed corn salesman, there were all kinds of other people that were doing things. You took them all into account. There's probably close to 100 businesses in town at one time. So there's no way we could hit them all in one program here by any means. But to look at some of the businesses who were at that time, this is one of the prominent businessmen in that time period. And at the time, there were a few people here that did recognize the person we had here. But this man was in business a long time in Schleswig. His name was Gus Hollander. And if you didn't actually know him, you probably recognized his sons more likely, Ted Hollander and Art Hollander, who are managing the Ford dealership here in town. Gus started his business of selling cars very early in the town's history. Probably in the first 10 or 15 years of the town's history, he started as a very young man. And when he did get going, he had the advantage that his father built him a garage to work on it. His father was Tom Hollander, who was one of the very early settlers in this area, and he did quite well. He came over as an immigrant, and by the time he retired, he had over 2,000 acres of land. He raised a large family and gave each of them a substantial farm, and in Gus's case, also a building in town to operate his business out of. That's a little closer image, better image of the building itself, which is still here across the street. But Gus Hollander and his sons soon outgrew that particular building with their business. And they had another investor in town here by the name of Chris LaFrance, who built a new building for them and leased it to him on a purchase to buy situation, and located it at the north end of 8th Street. So when they moved into this building, they also established the Ford car dealership, one of the very early Ford dealerships in the country. And they managed it until the Ford took back the leadership, or they quit the franchise not that many years ago. Another businessman here in town who was very prominent, and I think most of you probably do remember him, was Leonard Hollander. He was in the clothing business here in town. He also had a family background. His father, Peter Hollander, is the one who started the business, but Leonard inherited and took it over. This is the front of his building, and if you're familiar with it, this is the interior looks of his building that he had there. Another businessman in town here was this man, Louis Kastner, who was at that time was the head of the Farmers Mutual Insurance Company, and in his office he had the most modern equipment of the day. But that was, you have to consider, that was the day at the time. His office was this building, which was just west of the bank, the Farmer State Bank. But at that time, the Farmer State Bank wasn't quite the same size as it is now. Let's see, get the pointer going here. This building here is the insurance office that Louis Kastner was involved with. And on the other side of the bank over here was the Hollander clothing store, which we just talked about. And the interesting thing about it was both of those buildings were connected. They were one single building. One time, Hollander clothing store had two entrances. One on the east, where most people do remember it, but the south one, which is the insurance office, was also an entry into the Hollander clothing store at one time. But it got to be too cumbersome, so they divided it and split it into two businesses, although the building did go around the bank. And this man, of course, is another businessman here in town, which a lot of people do, I think, was Hap Peters. And he had the drugstore in town. And the interior was looked a lot like this. It had this soda fountain, was one of the main attractions in the whole community. The interesting thing about it being a drugstore was that most of the time he did not have a pharmacist there, because most of the doctors here in town distributed the drugs from their offices. They didn't give prescriptions to take to a drugstore. So most of the medicines they had in the drugstore here were over-the-counter medicines or veterinary supplies or something of that nature, or gift products, or the soda fountain, which is still a big thriving business, but it wasn't quite what you would think of from the name of being a drugstore. This is also a prominent businessman here in town, although he didn't always look or dress quite that way. This was Johannes Gosch, the town's blacksmith, and this was his more normal situation. But he was a very talented blacksmith, metalsmith. He could fix or make almost anything you could imagine. And he was also a very personable person. He sponsored quite a number of immigrants coming over from Germany and got them a start here in this country. One of the other things that was kind of interesting, I thought I talked to some people that they said they grew up here in town, and they said that one time they were playing in the LA near where he lived, which is just in the next block to the west, and Mrs. Gosch was out there, and she happened to notice these boys looked kind of despondent and didn't know what, kind of bored and didn't know what to do. So she made a suggestion for them. She said, if you look around and you find a piece of old iron someplace, you take it up to Johannes and he'll give you a nickel for it. You can go get yourself an ice cream at the drugstore. And they said over the years, Johannes bought quite a bit of rather useless old iron from the kids around town. This is the Gosch Farm Store, where they moved out of the blacksmith shop that we just saw into a little more modern facility, and expanded the types of products and material that they had available in inventory. They had the Minneapolis Moline implement dealership, as well as the repair shop. Here is another man who is quite active in the community for a long time. His name is Fred Peterson. His time in business dates back to where he was trading with horse and buggy equipment, and he would even trade horses and mules and that sort of thing, according to the ads that he had in the paper from those days. But he was through the 1940s and 50s. He was also quite active. In those years, he went into partnership with his son-in-law, Albert Mara. And their business is known as Peterson and Mara. And they had a large operation in this building here, which would be on the south side of Cedar Street, across from the south of the bank. They also, they had Massey Harris tractors and combines and machinery. They also had Farina supplies, feeds, and this sort of thing. And they had a large operation going. And in the basement of their building, Milt Winters had a repair shop, auto repair shop. And he had a pet fox on a chain out back that was half domesticated. It wasn't quite gentle, but it was there, and it was kind of an interesting attraction. He also had a 1903 Columbus automobile that he restored and used in parades every once in a while. Here, he and his wife, and at the little character in the center there is his son. But it's kind of interesting. He was back here. The boy was back here just a couple of weeks ago. He was representing one of the asphalt companies that was trying to work on the streets here. So he still remembered the old hometown. This is a picture of Cedar Street going west from the bank. In the very early days, there were businesses down that street, some pretty good sized buildings. But they were all taken down when Dr. Schultz decided he wanted to use that half a block for building his residence and his clinic. So he bought them out and had them all taken out of there, and he built his facilities in there instead. His house is still the one where Genesee lives in down there, and the clinic was just a little bit to the east of that. When he took these buildings down, there was one there in the center that's a little bit larger than the others. That was a hardware store at that time. And they decided that they were going to not destroy that building, but what they decided to do is you're going to move it across the street and set it up and operate on the south side of the street instead of on the north side, which they attempted to do, but they had a problem because halfway across the first floor collapsed on them. So when they got it there and got it set up, it turned out to be a one-story building. And it's what most of us, I think, remember as the Brockman Produce Station. But for a lot of years, it was also the John Deere dealership in town. Charles Jurgensen and Emil Boyk were in partnership and had a John Deere dealership for their years. And later it was taken over by Earl Stern. And when Earl Stern took it over, he decided to move it. So he built a new building for the John Deere dealership, and which is now the office for the office for the elevator down here now. But for a lot of years, that was the John Deere dealership. So we had Massey Ferguson dealership. We had the Minneapolis Moline dealership. We had a John Deere dealership, and across the street, Donald Dodge had the International Harvester dealership. So we had 4 implement dealerships here in town going at that time. He was a young man too that was quite active in that time, but a lot of people didn't recognize him, I'm afraid, but his name was Raymond Buster, excuse me, what's that?
Miller, was that?
Yeah,
Miller.
Raymond Miller, Buster Miller. And he had Buster's Produce Station, which is a quite active endeavor in those days. It was located where the Stylist Beauty Salon is now. And while a lot of people didn't really remember Buster Miller that well, they did have better memories of his brother, Fritz Miller. And he was quite active too when they had a bar and grill in this building and a bowling alley in the basement. He was the manager for quite a number of years, and a lot of people liked to go in the evenings after hours when the cafes were closed. He would have his grill going and made a lot of hamburgers for a lot of people in those days. This man too is quite active in the community and in business. This is John Evers, and you can see, notice he has a Texaco emblem on his shirt, and he was a partner with Broder Peterson. And they had the Texaco dealership here in town, and this is where they started out at, which wasn't all that large a building at the time. The thing that amazed me about this particular picture was the approaches, their drive up there was not paved. But then I got to thinking, you know, when this picture was taken, Highway 59 wasn't paved either yet. It was still a gravel road.
When do you know the date that they paved?
I think it was 1949, right? They paid it just in time for the Golden Jubilee here in Schleswig. 48, 49, somewhere in that time. This is what they developed it into, which is a much more modern station after they got the highway went through and after they got it all set up and paved. And by this time, the next generation had taken over. Broder Peterson's son, Bill Peterson, together with Beef Sonkson, and were operating the station. And John Evers' son Everett took over the tank wagon operation. So it's a pretty thriving business. Matter of fact, they were saying at one time that they had the largest volume of any service station in the county. This is not quite as large an operation. This is the Jaxo Electric Company, where they had an appliance store, which was behind the Maple River clothing store up here, or next to Miller's Diesel. The building is no longer there, but at that time it was a store that had the latest in electronic equipment and appliances that you could get. Okay, and then of course not all of the business people were men's. There's this is Rose Frederickson, who became Rose Mullendorf later on, and she operated a business here for quite some time as a beauty operator. And you see in her hot shop here that some of the equipment, like the hair dryer there, was pretty much the same as what you have now, but that other gadget up there is something you don't see much anymore. And this man was also a quite popular, quite active person in the community. For a German community, he was an Irishman that did well here. His name was Ed Riley, and he had Riley's Tavern, which was one of the main taverns in town at the time. That building also had a barber shop in the back and a cafe back there, and had apartments on the second floor. And it was quite a big operation at the time too.
So that's where the post office is.
Inside the interior, you can see here Ed is in behind the bar here, and he also had a staff of other bartenders to help keep the clientele served here. Let's see. The interesting thing, when they decided to take that building down, they discovered that the building next to it, the library building here that we're in, didn't have a west wall. It had built onto the building next to it. So when they took that building down, they had to leave the wall from the old building, right there, so that the library here would have a west wall on its building. So it's kind of an unusual situation there too. Another place here in town was Ben's Beer Parlor, and actually it was a pool hall. They call it Billards on the other window there. And that was also quite active. I didn't put all the places in, because there was a lot of times 4, 5, and 6 bars going at the same time in town here. But this one's Ben Witz, and he's behind the bar here. And also he had a staff behind him to keep things going. His clientele was a little more shy though. Where Riley was out there facing the camera, and these guys decided to look the other way.
It's my dad behind the bar.
This is a businessman here who was quite prosperous here in town too. This is Bill Wollenhaupt. And he came over from Germany, and he brought a bunch of recipes along with him, and he started a meat market and developed Schleswig sausage, which went over really well. And he did so well that he was able to build a new building, not only a full line grocery store, but a meat processing plant in the back and a cold storage locker units on the side. And at the time it was put in, it was written up as being one of the most advanced stores of its kind in the state. But he had competition. This is Hans Biermann, and he came over as a young man from Germany too, and started out as a clerk in one of the early grocery stores of Rickards grocery store. But when his boss retired, he was able to buy him out, and he moved the grocery store into a larger building. And for many years, this was the Biermann and Company full line grocery store. And they also had dry goods. The whole south section was dry goods.
Where was the Rickard?
What's that?
Where was the Rickard grocery store?
That was where that Gosh Farm store where Jack Johnson has his operation going in there now. Although I think it might have only been half of that store building, but I'm not done. I wasn't here at the time.
I just thought maybe you had read it or something.
Yeah. This building, of course, everybody remembers it as Fat's Place, but before that, it was a grocery store.
Well, that was Anita and PJ's.
Yeah. Even before that was when it was a grocery store, yeah. But it went through a number of different hands through the years on that, and it also had a locker plant on the west side of it. Over here was a cold storage locker, which you could go in, and for years afterwards that was used as a cooler tube, rather than being something open to the public, but it was there. And in this town, there was a lot of trucks for some reason. It was when the highway was paved and the trucking business really got going, we had a lot of truckers here in town. Some of the local truckers were with straight trucks, others with long haul semis and this type of thing, but there were quite a number of them. And if you notice on the street here, there's a lot of cars parked there. The businesses were quite busy and most of the time. It was a quite active business community. This man too was quite active, C.J. Clausen. He was manager of the Farmers Lumber and Grain. It was a large business. It had a huge lumber yard. It had sort of provided coal for the community when coal was the major source of heating. It had a hardware store in it, and it had feeds for livestock in it. So it was a big operation. It was a corporation that was owned by farmers, and the Clausen family were the managers of it. C.J. John Clausen and his son Clausen Clausen. But they weren't the only lumber yard, because we also had the Green Bay lumber yard, which is up where the UBI Bank is now, and it was a large and quite active operation too. This picture goes back a little bit earlier times. The reason I put it in there is, let's back that up. Up here, this building at the top of the picture is a building where the Hollander Motor Company building was before it was built. And that was also a lumber yard at one time. So there were a number of lumber yards. Of course, everybody was building up farms, building up businesses, and they needed a lot of building supplies. The railroad was the reason the town was located where it is now. But by the end of the 1940s into the 1950s, the roads were getting better. The highway was planning on being paved, and the railroads were running into maintenance problems on some of their lines. So they decided they were going to start pulling out their rail lines. So in 1954, all of the rail lines from Schleswig south and west were abandoned and taken out. And Schleswig for a time was the end of the line for the railroad here. But we still had enough livestock being shipped out and enough products to being brought in and sold here that they kept the line open to Schleswig for a number of years after that. And later that decade, before they decided that even that didn't pay, so they abandoned the entire railroad. And this is where the railroad came into town on the southwest corner of town. Two ladies from Ida Grove came down, Miss Rock and Miss Hollander, and they built a cafe and motel on the side of where the railroad tracks had been, and it's still now being used as a veterinary clinic. And I think the motel part is being just rented out as rooms or apartments. Earl Sheldorf was the one who managed it for a lot of years after the two ladies decided to retire.
He didn't own it? Sheldorf didn't own it?
I think they did, but that was after the other ones
First
retired
they
and wanted to get out of it. They sold it and he took it over.
I thought they
This is a group of businessmen who are active here in town too. And most people, I don't think, have too much trouble recognizing Bart Wielenberg. He was a rather imposing figure, and he was so well known as an auctioneer and real estate salesperson, and just had a hog operation. And next to him is Julius Rohr, who is the head of the bank here. What's going on? There we go. Julius Rohr took it over from his father Theodore when Theodore retired, and he was the head of the bank here. And over here on the side is Eddie Clausen, who took it over after Julius Rohr retired. And then down here in the corner is Ben Wielenberg, who is the other half of the Wielenberg brothers auction team. Bart would cry the auction, and Ben was the bid catcher working the crowd. And he used to say he was really good at getting a lot of people to make one extra bid more than they really wanted to, and keep the auction going good. These are the two doctors here in town, Dr. Jones and Dr. Schultz. Dr. Jones is the one who's standing there. Both of them had a 50-year medical career here in Schleswig, and the community really depended on them for their medical needs. This man was a little less known. His name is Ernest Morrison. He was the superintendent of schools in those days, and he didn't stay real long. But what he did do was he hired this man, Willard Topp, to be the coach. And Coach Topp was the one who introduced varsity athletics to the Schleswig school system. And the school system was all centered essentially in these buildings in this complex here. This is the inside of the gymnasium. This is a picture when the stage in the gymnasium was on the north wall. And later in the years, they've added an addition and put it on the west wall. And this was just used as bleachers after that. But this is an earlier picture. And this was one of the classrooms on the second floor of the high school building. And I remember it fairly well. I don't know how many people here do yet, but it was there and we used it. But this was one of the rooms in the basement. What was? Yeah, this is home ec room. It's where the girls learned how to cook, at least as much as they could learn on a hot plate. They did have a stove over here, but just one stove for the entire class, and a refrigerator over there. So it was a little bit skimpy on equipment. Next door to it was the shop room, which is a woodworking shop and all hand tools, which is very few power tools involved there. And at least a couple of weeks during each year, they would switch classes. And the girls would come into the shop where they learn how to pound in a nail, and the boys would go over to the home ec where they learn how to make cupcakes. So that was the extent of our broadening experiences in those days. The park is going already by that time, and we had the shelter house up there, and the interior of the shelter house looks somewhat like it does today. The fireplace is still the same as it was today. And this set of cabinets on the side over here, I think, is pretty much like it is today yet. Now the appliances, they were updated.
They are. That sink might still be there. Isn't it? Okay.
The other part that I always thought was interesting about it was that there's the electrical box on the side wall here and a little box next to it. And if you wanted to use electricity in there, which usually just meant the lights, you had to put a quarter in the box. And then you get so many minutes of electricity. And when that ran out, you had to find the box and get another quarter in there. And this was the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which was the forerunner of the UCC church now. It was the first church in town, and it wasn't built until 5 years after the town was established. So it was the feature that was a little bit unique in that sense. For those who remember it looking like this, but earlier, both the side steeple and the main steeple had pointed peaks that were quite tall up there. But they had problems with those. They had to remove them, I think as early as 38 or something like that. But this is the way the building did look, and this is what the interior was looking like for that building. The other church in town was the Lutheran church, but it wasn't built until 12 years after the town was established. And it served for quite a number of years too before it was moved to Ricketts. And this is the interior looking of that particular church. This is just a street scene that I wanted to mention in here. I think I want to mention mainly about it, because if you notice the trees, they're all white birch trees. In those days, the whole town was covered mainly with white birch trees, and every house was painted white, and that was kind of the signature of the community in those days. But sometime during the 1940s, some disease came in and wiped out all the white birch trees. And then 20 years later, the Dutch elm disease came through and wiped out all of the elm trees. and now we got the emerald ash borer, which is gonna threaten all of the ash trees in town. So it goes through kind of a cycle on that. That was kind of what a lot of the things that I talked about in the original slideshow that we had here. But I was going to stop and now no longer stay with that one particular time period. I like to broaden it out just a little bit and talk a little bit more general terms about the Schleswig community for a little bit. When Iowa first became, this part of the country, I shouldn't even say Iowa, when this part of the country first became part of the United States, it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. The only Europeans that were in this part of the country at all were a few French fur traders who came through and traded with the Indians for furs. When Lewis and Clark made their expedition to the West Coast and back, on their whole trip, they only found really one place that had a place name that had a European name to it. The rest of them were all Indian names of one kind or another. But the one European name that they found was the Boyer River. And it's probably named after one of the fur traders that came through here, although there's some question of whether who he was or where he came from. But that was a very early place name that was in this part of the country. The large part of the area that was this included Iowa came under the jurisdiction of Captain William Clark when he got back from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he was in charge of it. And at that time it was considered Indian territory and it was off limits to white settlement. The whites weren't allowed to settle in this part of the country at all in those days. And during that time, we did have some people that traveled through there. One of the things that happened was there was a military expedition in 1820 that came up through this part of the country. They were going from a fort just north of Omaha across Iowa here and end up at Fort Snelling near Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when they came up the Boyer River to somewhere in here and headed north toward the Little Sioux River. And the records that we had of that expedition was the journals of one of the officers, Stephen Watts Kearney. And he kept observations of the landscape and of the plants, of the animals, everything he could see to fairly complete journey of his trip. And according to his indications, it looked very much like on July the 6th of that year, they camped either right on the site of Schleswig here or very near it. And okay, and then the thing I was going to mention, a few years ago, or about 3 years ago, I guess it was now, a friend of mine, Glenn Pollock, and I gave a presentation at the Les Hills Prairie Seminars, just west of here, on European influence on the hills, and we included this expedition as part of it. And they thought it was kind of interesting that we were invited back for the following year to give a presentation just on this trip, this expedition, military expedition. But unfortunately, the COVID pandemic interfered and delayed it. We weren't able to do it right away. And during that delay, something very interesting happened. A new book was published. And it was published about this expedition. It was the first new information in nearly 200 years, and it happened just when we were preparing our presentation for this trip. The book was based on the notes of the science officer who was who was assigned to that trip. And he was using a sextant and other instruments, and he was a little more precise as to the exact locations where they're at each time than what Stephen Watts Kearney was when he was making the general observations of this site. And it turns out that they moved a little bit farther east before they turned north than what we had assumed before. So instead of camping right on Schleswig, they had gone a little farther east and they actually camped on the Vernon Boss Road down here south of town. And when they turned north, they went up the Big Creek Valley, which is about 2.5 miles east of town here. So they just skirted around the outside of Schleswig when they went through. Big Creek is the one where the new sewer system drains into out here. This operation was quite close to us. Except they made some rather interesting observations. They were saying that they went for day after day, in part of the going up through northwestern Iowa here, where they couldn't find enough wood for a campfire. They were out on prairie. And that was in this part. When they got into northern Iowa, they got into the pothole region where there was not very much drainage, or a lot of swampy, damp areas where it was difficult to travel through. And when they got past that, they got into northeast Iowa, which is really rough country in some areas. And by the time they got through, their final report was that as far as traveling from a little north of Omaha, their fort, to the fort in Minnesota, by Minneapolis, they said there was no feasible route to travel through here. And in 1820, they were probably right, but things have changed a bit since then. Okay, pick up from where they left in 1820. Iowa was open to settlement in 1832 after the Black Hawk War. And in the 1840s, the Mormons came through across southern Iowa, and they camped at Council Bluffs and wintered over there. A huge number of people on their way to Utah following Brigham Young. And they were camped at Council Bluffs down here, and they needed a lot of food to maintain that size of a camp. So they sent out hunters in all directions to bring in wild game to help feed the people. And one of their best hunters was a man by the name of Jesse Mason. And he loved to hunt up through the Boyer River here and some of the woods along the Boyer River. And they said he would send wagon loads of venison back down to help feed the people down there. And he liked the country up here so well that he decided to stay and settle, and he founded the town of Deloitte. And there's also another Mormon settled at Gallons Grove, which is a little southwest of Dow City. Those are some of the earlier settlements that happened here. In the 1850s, Jesse Dennison came and started the town of Denison, but it really didn't get going much until the Transcontinental Railroad came through right after the Civil War. When it did, it brought a lot of new people into this part of the country, a lot of them from the German settlements in eastern Iowa and also directly from Europe itself. But this part of the country that's up here, and this part of the country, was open prairie, like you see in the pictures here. It was prairie grass that had a large matting of 10-foot deep roots that were extremely difficult to farm, to plow, and they grew back quickly. So the people that came into the prairies here to try setting up a farming operation, the first settlers, in the first year, they were lucky to get a garden to grow. And many times there wasn't much lumber. This picture shows some trees along there. The only trees were really along the major rivers, like the Boyer River. And if you got very far away from that, you didn't have much for lumber. So they would be first staying in sod houses or in dugouts for the first year or two until they could import enough lumber to build buildings. So it's a pretty rough deal. And even if they wanted to get supplies, a trip to Denison to get supplies was usually a 2-day affair. Where here we go and down and pick up stuff and be back in an hour and a half or whatever. But when you had behind a plotting workhorse pulling a heavy farm wagon, and where there's no roads and very few bridges, and that you could make it probably most of the morning to get to Denison, and that was in good weather. And once you're there, then you had to get your supplies and do whatever business you had to do. And by the time you were ready, it was questionable whether you could make it back home before dark or not. And believe it or not, there are no street lights in those days. You could get lost out there pretty easily. So it was a lot easier to stay over and go back the next day. It also gave them an opportunity to socialize a bit because in the very first times, there wasn't too much social activity going because people were so far apart. So it was kind of a whole different type of a situation that going to get things developed in this area. But when it did start to get developed, and we started getting enough people here, and they were starting to get themselves settled, then it was feasible to get stores that were closer to businesses that could operate a little more closely here. And one of the first persons to take advantage of that was a man by the name of Albrecht Buch. And he set up a store on his farm, and it grew into the town of Morgan, which is a mile east of the Morgan Cemetery. This is about the only picture that I was able to find of it. It shows the dance hall at Morgan. It was a fairly substantial dance hall that he built. And the activity out front was an insurance meeting, which is a German insurance company, which is a forerunner to the Farmers Mutual. And I did have some people that thought they recognized some of the people that were in the front rows of the people here. Actually, there was quite a bit more to the town. They had a store in the back, they had a blacksmith shop, they had a tavern, they had post office, and all this sort of thing here. So they had a lot of activity going there. And actually, I can remember when I was a kid, when we go past there, on the hill south of the place, you could still see some depressions where there had been buildings or houses built at one time. But there is not too much to show, I think, anymore now today. They also, this was kind of the social center of the area too. They would have things like lawn bowling. They didn't have a bowling alley, but they would set pins up on the pasture and have a lawn bowling type of thing. They also have some of the traditional festivals like the Kinderfest, which is a children's festival in the spring. And my great-grandmother was in charge of the women's and children's activities for a number of years at the Kinderfest at the town of Oregon. So they had things going pretty good. But as the country developed more and more people came in, and the ones that were here who started to become more prosperous, there was an opportunity to expand and to have more things available, and even at such a, excuse me, even an additional town, which they did. Jürgen Schrader was the one who took advantage of that situation and developed the town of Hohenzollern in the 1890s. This picture here doesn't really show too much about the town itself, but we can see it. There's a couple of pictures later that'll show some of the influence that the town had. The name came from the royal family of Prussia, whose family name was Hohenzollern, and they used that as the name for the town. But it was going, and then in 1899, the railroads came through and built a line through here. But there were two things that were kind of different about the railroad line that came through here. Was first of all, they dropped the siding between the two towns. They did not go to either the town of Morgan or the town of Hohenzollern. They stopped between the two. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of them that the railroad said was that they wanted to stay on the ridge line, because that way they would have to build fewer bridges, and they could build the line faster and get it into operation quicker than if they had tried to go to any particular location that had already been established. The other one they never mentioned, but it I think was probably also influential, was that when they came through, they bought the whole farm from Henry Sugsdorf, which is had the farm where Schleswig is now. And they plotted out the new town of Schleswig, and they started selling the lots off of it. That they had control of all of the lots, and they were able to sell them all and make some good money out of it. Whereas if they'd gone to one of the existing towns, the commercial properties were already sold and owned by people. So they were in the business to make money. And I think it had an influence about what their decisions as to where to put the siding to develop a new town. This is an interesting thing too. The town of Hohenzollern, when the railroad came through here, wasn't very old yet. Hohenzollern only listed for, I think, a little less than 10 years. And as a result, their buildings were in pretty good shape. And the people in Hohenzollern decided they were going to move the buildings and all into town here. So they hired a moving outfit out of Council Bluffs, and they moved almost all of their buildings from their town site to this town site, which is a little over a mile away. And this is a picture of the north end of Main Street here. And the first three buildings that are showing on here were moved in from Hohenzollern. And they're pretty substantial buildings, so you can imagine that the town site out there was also a pretty substantial town site. So like I say, there was quite a bit going on out there
So
too.
is that where Fritz's and the steakhouse, is that corner? What
That corner, yeah, that's
That
the
is
corner
that
they were
corner.
on.
Okay,
There were
Okay.
first three buildings were
okay.
from Hohenzollern. But that wasn't just all that they brought in, because they brought more buildings in. The blacksmith shop was also brought in from Hohenzollern. And if you look in the background, there's a house back there that Jürgen Schrader brought in and turned it into a home. It was used for a different purpose out at the former town site. And then on this time, this picture was taken up by where the UPI bank is. And if you look down off the side, there's this building off in the corner here. That was a dance hall that was brought in from Hohenzollern. It didn't really last. Of all the buildings they brought in, that one didn't last the least amount of time, because it had got kind of a reputation for being a rowdy place, and there was even a gunfight in there one time, and as a result, people stopped going there. And they discontinued it as a dance hall, and there was some person once mentioned they thought that Gus Hollander started his car dealership when he was a very young man in that building there yet. But I don't know for sure about that. But that building was there, and it didn't last too long. But there's a lot of buildings that were brought in from Hohenzollern. And today there's only one left. We only have one building in town that still came in from Hohenzollern. And that is the tin shed in the alley behind the city hall. That came in from out there yet, and that's the only one.
Still there.
The town of Morgan down there, their buildings were a lot older than Hohenzollern. They were 25, 30 years old by the time town started here. So they didn't, and they were a little farther away too, so they didn't try moving anything in. They came in and built new. And at that time, Opera Hook, who started the town of Morgan, was up to nearing retirement age, but he had three sons, Herman, Ernest, and Emil. And they came into town, and they were pretty active for some time here. They put together this building here on a block south of Cedar Street, which is a farm supply store, implements and farm supplies, and they had a produce station along the side. And they were quite active. Herman actually was the first mayor of Schleswig. When the railroad plotted the town of Schleswig, they wanted Cedar Street to be the main commercial street. But when Hohenzollern put all their buildings on a block north of Cedar Street, and the Oak family from the town of Morgan put all their buildings on a block south of Cedar Street, it's the north-south street that became the main commercial district instead. So it wasn't planned that way, but it worked out that way. This was a very early picture of Schleswig. Some of the buildings up here in the corner are the ones that came in from Hohenzollern. You can't quite catch the ones down here that were from the town of Morgan, except that the blacksmith at Morgan was a guy by the name of Week, and he built a wagon works here, where he built and repaired wagons. His son, Henry Week, was a longtime painter here in town, and his grandson, Dean Week, was the projectionist at the movie theater here for a long time. So the family was here for quite a number of years. This is an early picture of the streets in Schleswig here, the business district. And the thing I wanted to mention about this was this is a very early picture in the first few years of the town. And Schleswig did not start slowly like a lot of towns that did in the surrounding area, because we already had commercial enterprises going in the two centers already, and we had a large population that was already established. So when Schleswig started a town, it started with a bang, and it grew fast and quick, and was quite successful very early on.
Where did they get their electricity from back then? See, you got all the electrical things in there.
From there, they had their own electric plant. The building that the Midwest had, and they sold out to it, was an electric generating plant. They generated their own electricity from engines in the plant there. Although I don't know too much about exactly when they started, but it was fairly early in the town's history. They brought in John Zaxel as an engineer to run it, and they set up the plant and they operated it for quite some time. Not everything worked smoothly though in Schleswig. This is what happened to those first three buildings that they came in from Hohenzollern. On Christmas Eve, 1913, it was going to be a long weekend, so they really stocked up the furnace to keep it going so they wouldn't have to stop back all the time and keep it going. Well, they overdid it, and it overheated, and it burned all three buildings down. So the flames were so hot it cracked the windows across the street.
My grandpa had a pool hall there that burned down that night.
Oh, did it? Okay, all right. Yeah, there were three buildings there, and they all went. Going to the social side of things just a bit, there were three large organizations here in town in the early days that were quite active and quite influential. First one here was the Sons of Herman Lodge. There was Herman was a folk hero, German folk hero. Way back when he organized the German people, and they completely annihilated 3 Roman legions back in about the time of Christ. And they said that was what prevented Rome from taking over all of Europe and saved the culture and the languages for most of Northern Europe, including German, English, and all the Scandinavian countries. So he was considered a hero, and they had an organization, the Sons of Herman, to honor him and to do social works around here. And they also did funeral arrangements for their members. And they used to have markers in the cemetery out here for members of the Sons of Herman, but I don't think any of them survived. I think they're all gone. The second organization, well, I should say before I leave that one, that organization lasted until just before the First World War, when we had a real big wave of anti-German hysteria because we were fighting Germany in the First World War. The prejudice against them got to them and they disbanded. So they did not survive the First World War era. The second group was the Modern Woodmen of America. And their unique feature was they had a precision drill team, would do march formations and do all kinds of special features. But instead of using weapons, they used woodworking tools like axes and mallets and this type of thing when they did their fancy work. When World War I came around, because of their experience with marching and precision drilling and stuff, when they got into base camp for the military, they just went flying through the basic training. And as a result, they were some of the first Americans that were sent to the front lines. And they got into some of the heaviest fighting of the First World War. And as a result, when they came back, the survivors that did come back decided they wanted nothing to do with anything military anymore. And their membership declined to the place where they had to dissolve entirely. One of the other interesting features about it was when they did dissolve, they had a practice ground where they did their practicing for their drills, and they donated that to the city, and that's our city park now. The third organization here was the International Order of Odd Fellows. That was a international organization that had chapters all over the world. And in town here, they had a very active chapter. And as a matter of fact, they were the group that when the big fire occurred where all three of the buildings from Hohenzollern were destroyed, it was the International Order of Oddfellows that stepped up and built their new building for their club on the corner there to fill in the lots that were, or at least one of the lots that had been destroyed by the fire here. And they built their lodge building there. They had, and I think you probably noticed the IOF symbol on the top of the building for years. Their second floor was a dance floor and meeting room. And the first floor, of course, was a bar and grill and a bowling alley in the basement. But they stepped up to help out the town when it was looking down because of the fire that destroyed so much of it. And they lasted until well into the 1940s, nearly 1950s. I think their women's auxiliary, the Rebecca's, even lasted a little bit longer than the men's group. But they picked up a lot of members too, and the other groups started fading and disappearing. A lot of their members came and joined them, so they were large and influential for a lot of years. One of the other things that happened here in town was the firemen here had a firemen's tournament, the Maple Valley Firemen's Tournament. We had all the fire departments from different towns around the area here come in for a big tournament. But it turned into a bit of a tragedy because an awful lot of the people that were there got sick, really sick. Some of them were sick for weeks, and sometimes the worst ones for months. And there's more than one explanation for what it was. The common theory that most people had was that it was food poisoning. That they had prepared, I think, they thought a potato salad in copper metals, which wasn't supposed to be done, I guess, and it was the cause of it, and it was such a virulent strain that it actually perforated the intestines of some of the ones who were afflicted by it. But that was the common theory. The official theory said that it was typhoid fever, but typhoid's a water-based disease, and they couldn't find any evidence other than the fact that that one time people got sick. Didn't know the source, and they didn't know was a one-time occurrence, which is very unusual for typhoid. But that was a controversy, and as a matter of fact, it wasn't that many years ago, and I remember quite clearly, or if you wanted to get in a good argument in town, just bring up that subject. And there were people that would argue it on both sides of the real weird. Matter of fact, two people actually died during that. One girl from here in town had an appendectomy, and was in such a weakened state from being sick here that she didn't survive. And another young person from the Midway area up by Battlecreek didn't survive.
Sorry, what kind of tournament, you know?
I don't know a lot about the tournament except that they had a group of, all these firemen came in for meetings and I suppose games and competitions of some kind.
Fire hoses and that kind of thing.
I think, but I can't, I'm assuming that, I don't know for sure on that. I suppose it could be something that it might be some record of someplace, but I don't know it right now.
I'll pass them run their wagon down the street.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you suppose this tour went to different towns in the county?
Could have been, I wouldn't doubt it because in different years, they probably were hosted by different communities. But it's a little bit before my time, 1909, there wasn't too much going on at that time. As far as, that's the very earliest that we have any record of our newspapers here in town. And to find out other information from before that or at that time was getting just a little bit on the early side of being able to find it. But I was going to say that there was enough people that got sick that Dr. Schultz turned his residence into a hospital. And he brought nurses in from as far away as Council Bluffs. And they were there for weeks, and I think they closed it down. This was a tournament happened in June, and it was September before the last of them left, and they were able to close that hospital down again. And there were some good things that were happening too. For example, this was an article that appeared in the Schleswig Library in 1910. And you can see on the top picture there, little Lizzie standing on a chair to reach the telephone on the wall. And she was calling Santa Claus to wanted to know if Santa Claus would be coming to Schleswig. And he said, sure he was. He was going to be here on the Saturday, December the 21st. He was going to Klaus Gottberg's store. And she should bring all of her friends to see Santa Claus. And they did. And this was at Gottberg's store. And his promotion went over so big that he just about couldn't handle all the crowd. The interesting thing about the store is it was in the back of the store, he had a freight elevator which run by ropes, and he could pull heavy items up to the second floor of the store out of his inventory. And when the Santa Claus came, they brought him down on the freight elevator. It was an open elevator, down to the crowd below. It wasn't quite coming in down the chimney, but for most of the kids it was close enough.
So where is that building?
This was what we talked to earlier about Peterson and Marth building. It's on the south side of Cedar Street, across from, south of the bank, next to Fats. Okay, well, like I said, he got out of hand, and he got more kids than what he could handle in his building. So the rest of the merchants here decided they'd like to get in on the action too a little bit, so they took over the Santa Claus Day, and from then on it was in the street for a long time, and Santa Claus would be just coming on the back of a pickup. And it's still going today. They got a bag of goodies each back then, they still do today. Other things that happened there in the middle of Main Street at that time was right after the First World War, when the last of the veterans who were able to return back here again, they had a huge celebration. People were ready to celebrate because the war was over, the anti-German hysteria that had developed during the war was over, the Spanish flu epidemic, which had gotten a lot of people sick and a lot of people died from, had pretty much gone away, and things were getting back to normal again on a lot of different levels, and they were ready to celebrate. And they had about a 2-day celebration with all kinds of games and activities and fun events, and it was highlighted by this particular event where the mayor of Schleswig decided to get married in the front of Main Street in front of thousands of people that were gathered there at the time. So that was the big event of the season that year. Then a couple years later, they tried to put on a fair here, which last year when we had our celebration and calf show, it was 100 years before our 100 years ago that we had this fair that they had, and it was according to the Schleswig Library, 15,000 people came to Schleswig. And of course, at that time, Schleswig was probably 600 or 700 people, so they were kind of crowded for a while. And they had all kinds of activities then too. Here's one of the stands they had built with a free acts. They had the number of free acts that were going on. They had bands. They had this stage. They had the Denison band on, and the upper intersection they had another stage where they had a band from Holstein down that was playing, and they had games and livestock shows, and I think that must have had the whole area down by the stockyards with one big livestock show. And I do still have a few of the printed copies of what was said there, and some of the winners of the prizes and that, and anybody wants one, they can have one on the way out. So that was a big deal, but the problem was it turned out to be a one-shot deal. It was huge, and it was very successful for that 1 year. The next year they wanted to try to put it on again, and they couldn't get together to get things organized, and then they decided they were going to try to make it a membership deal and make it kind of a county fair or something, and that didn't go over. And then pretty soon there was the other things that came up that got their attention away, and it never really developed again. On the social level, this is one of the buildings that was one of the main social centers in the town, the Opera House. And it was a dance hall, and they had put on plays there. Matter of fact, even when they first had the first movies in town, they were shown in the Opera House. And organizations that have their meetings at the school even used it as a gymnasium. And it was there for about 40 years, and it was really the center of activities.
Just 4 years?
Hmm?
Just 4 years is what it said.
Well, it was started very early in the town, and it was taken down, I think, in about 43 or 44. So,
I can remember going there.
Yeah.
They had children's things going on.
Oh, yeah.
It sat on the corner where Harry Wallendorf's
Yeah.
house is.
Mhm. Yep. Okay.
Remember that your grandpa,
Hmm?
I think it was your grandpa that built that?
My great grandfather
Yeah.
built the Lutheran church and he
Oh,
built,
okay.
yeah, he built that too.
Okay. So, yeah.
It dates me
First-hand
too,
knowledge.
doesn't it?
But it wasn't the only dance hall in town. We also had the Playmore Dance Hall a mile east of town.
Lawrence Welk played out there.
Yeah, you did. And I think that was the place where the younger people wanted to go if they wanted to get away from the prying eyes of the older people. So instead of having it in town, they were a mile out of town. And there were probably more things going on there than what they let us know about. Then in 1925, they had a major project here in town. They ripped up all the streets, put in sewer lines, water lines, and paved it all. But it wasn't just any ordinary pavement. They had a special pavement. You put a concrete pan under it with 6 to 8 inches of coal tar pitch, with quartzite, chunks of quartzite in it, and then a coating over the top. And all the streets had gutters, and it was we had the most advanced streets of any town in the county, or in the county, in the state at that time. So and for that matter, even today, our streets rank among the better ones in most towns around. And this plaques like this were on every block, but they were made out of brass, and over the years, most of them disappeared.
Where did you have this one? Is this one
Yeah,
somewhere?
this is the last one. We have it here in the library.
Oh, do you?
But that's the only one we found, and we only found that one because they happened to asphalt over it. And we happened to notice that that oval shape was stuck in there and scraped it off. My gosh, there was still one there yet. So we saved it. There were a number of businesses in town. This was a hotel that was called the Wooden Hotel. It was where Shita's place was now. It was one of the huge hotels here in town, and very early one. The other hotel was the Brick Hotel. It was made out of brick. And when it was a hotel, the northern part of it here was a large restaurant, and the other side, the south side, was the counter for the hotel sign-in place, and the people who ran the hotel had apartments in behind it. Between the two was a grand stairway up to the rooms on the second floor. And of course, the bank was started here by the Baxter brothers from Ida Grove, and it got started there until they brought in Theodore Rohr to run it and be the cashier and manager. And that he did until just about the time of the First World War, when the farm economy was doing very well because of the pre-war prices were quite high. And he was able to organize quite a number of the farmers together, and they formed a corporation and bought out the bank and formed the Farmer State Bank. And Theodore Rohr was, of course, the president of it at that time and passed it down through his family. It was the only bank in town, though, because this building was also a bank. It started, it was known as the German Bank, and then at the time of the First World War, it was not good to be called German, so they called it the Commercial Bank, and it lasted until the Great Depression when it folded too. This building was very interesting. This is a saloon, and it was quite popular, you see, by the number of people out front here. And they decided that that building wasn't very good, though. It was small and it wasn't all that great a shape, so they were going to replace it. So, but instead of giving up their bar and their fun time, they took that building and moved it out into the street and operated it as a saloon until the building that replaced it was built and finished. Then they moved into it.
Only in Schleswig.
And nobody cared that it was in the middle of the street?
No, apparently not. We just got away with it.
Here is always, where is that?
Oh, this is, well, it's located at the post office. This was
Oh,
where,
yeah.
we had Riley's Tavern there before, that was the building they replaced it.
They're fun, are they?
Oh, okay, we had this already. Oh, okay. When you talk about social activities, when the JCs came in town and got active, we started the Beer Fest. And here's one of the scenes of the crowds that we attracted at the Beer Fest. There's 2,500 people there. They not had a huge beer stand, but they also served a meal, German style meal, and they had a band, which I think is probably across the street over there, warming up for a street dance. And the thing that I always thought was interesting about that, if you went there, it started about 6 in the evening and went until all hours of the night. But if you went there at 6 o'clock, it was mainly the older people in town came for the meal and maybe a drink and listen to some music if the music had started. And every hour as the time the evening went on, the crowd got at least 10 years younger. Until at the end, it was mostly very young people that were still left there.
Then when it was all over, we brought in the Boy Scouts to clean up. Pick up
Oh, yeah, is that right? They had the opportunity, they could pick up the cans and they could cash them in, and that was one of their fundraisers.
Yeah.
And of course, the signature deal for activities in town was the calf show. And we had quite a stockyard set up at that time. And the fathers would buy a whole herd of cattle and bring them in and gate cut them into pens of 5. And the kids that were interested in doing it would draw for which pen of calves they would have. And then they would have to go into the bank and negotiate a loan and sign a loan for those particular cattle. And they had to keep records of how they fed them. And the whole idea was it was supposed to be a training ground for the kids for the cattle raising industry, which was huge in those days. And they wanted to be able to have an activity where their kids could learn something about the business. And then at the end of the celebration, they would auction off the cattle, but only commercial packing bidders could bid on them. They wanted to keep the prices in line rather than having feed companies or relatives or whoever else bid them up for outrageous prices. They wanted to keep it as close to being practical as possible. And it lasted as long as the cattle industry survived in this part of the country. But when the feeding cattle industry left this part of the country, then I'm afraid the calf show did too.
When was the last year that the actual calf show ended, do you know?
Oh,
Approximately,
that was
I sent
early
something.
2000s here, wasn't it, when the last of them?
The last calf show.
Yeah.
I sent you some information, so
Oh,
I
good.
don't remember what it was.
It wasn't.
We tried again, though after,
Yeah, they
then
did, yeah.
they did try later.
I sent
Yeah,
that,
they
And
tried.
it just
sent that
didn't.
September.
No, there wasn't enough people involved in it, and there were a lot of farmers didn't have pens for them anymore. And they didn't have kids that were interested in raising cattle anymore, and it just faded out.
A lot less farmers.
And a lot less farmers, true. But some features that are still around. They had a parade back then, a huge parade, and they still have that. And they have the carnival yet and everything, but no more calves. But we do have a lot of things that are going on in town yet. We certainly remodeled the community building and got it going good, and we got a new bank building up here with the United Bank and a new country club. And sausage plant is going strong, although it's Quality Meats now. And we had Bedrock come in here, and along with it, Blue River Construction, Waterers growing up there, and Reliance Manufacturing, and New Harvest Windmills. And we got a lot of things going yet, but we have to keep track of those because we got the new celebration coming up here in a few years. And that's one of the things that we're trying to get some interest in growing by putting on some of these programs. So if you want to be involved, there's a lot of things going on that'll be happening here in the following year.